Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this evening, particularly after a drinks reception. So your dedication to being here is hugely appreciated. Tonight we're going to have a short event looking at slaps in the broader context of the safety of journalists. And we've heard a lot today about how slaps come as part of a strategy often to isolate and intimidate journalists. We heard from Carol Cadwallader talking about how she was really hived off from other journalists and papers who were reporting on Arron Banks. She was targeted individually, and what preceded her was a huge smear campaign to delegitimize her, to scapegoat her, to isolate her from her employer. And that in that context, this massive legal action was taken against her, and taken against her alone. We heard from Claire Rewcastle-Brown about how her slap case came in the context of an illegal surveillance campaign, of threats, of hacking of her accounts. And we saw in the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia how legal threats preceded her assassination. So there was a smear campaign, 47 legal threats. She talked about how they were trying to fry her alive with the slaps she was facing. And I think there's a very specific form of harassment that comes with legal intimidation, which is really to, in a sort of official way, denigrate who you are, what your work stands for, to delegitimize you. And as Carol said, to sort of make it it's sort of fair game on the trolls, on the harassers. And we know that these sort of online threats often precede physical attacks. So it's in that context that tonight's panel is going to look at legal threats in the broader context of safety of journalists. There's a long history of case law and of mechanisms, let's say at the Council of Europe level and the regional level, on safety of journalists. Initially, those mechanisms really focused on physical threats and attacks against journalists. More lately, they've recognised that online threats are also very serious threats against journalists, and they often precede physical attacks. And then it's really been probably in the last couple of years, and particularly it's in Europe in the last 5 years since Daphne's assassination, that we've recognised strategic lawsuits as a specific threat against journalists. You can see that on the platform, the Council of Europe platform on safety of journalists. You can see it in the case law of the European Court, an increasing recognition that legal threats fall within the systemic threats against journalists, and that the response to these threats must be holistic and must include slaps. And that's why we've been working so hard to have slaps included in all of the legal responses. So tonight we have both online, Rana Ayyub, who's a journalist with the Washington Post. Hi, Rana. We have Sir John Whittingdale, MP, Minister for State, Tourism and Creative Industries. We have Peter de Velde, who's the reporter and project manager at PersVeilig. We have, this is just frozen. Dawson, Tim Dawson, so replacing Michelle Stainstreet, I'm so sorry, Tim Dawson from the National Union of Journalists. And then we have Yeğinsu, Barrister and Deputy Chair of the High Level Panel on Legal Experts. So Rana, just starting with you, we know you've been through so much in terms of reprisals for your work as a journalist. I wonder if you could talk a little about your experiences of the attacks against you as a result of your work, and how slaps fit into the broader picture of attacks on journalists.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and good evening to everyone. Before we begin, panel, you spoke Cadwallader, the journalist from UK, and the attempt to discredit journalists, whether it's online, offline, how online threats often lead to offline attacks on journalists. Just 2 hours before, on my Twitter handle, I posted a screenshot video, a video grab of the hate that I have been receiving intensely over the last 3 days, where I have been, rape threats, death threats, calling me a prostitute for just sharing an article, for just not even writing an article, but sharing an article on Twitter written by somebody else. And this morning when I arrived from the US to India, I was just clearing the immigration, and this guy in the queue came forward and said, "Why are you so Hindu phobic? Why are you so much against Hindus?" So some of us journalists who are critical of the government, especially in a country like India, are made enemies of the state, where we are made to look like we are the enemy of an entire population, especially of the majority population, which makes it easier for the government to fix us or to kind of come after us at this point of time. I mean, I just came from the US. Tomorrow morning I have a court hearing in a defamation case for an article I wrote 15 years ago, right, in 2009. And the allegation against me is that I'm a practicing Muslim, hence prejudiced. While I was in the US, my lawyers were fighting two cases back home. I have a tax evasion case, money laundering. I have another case. So what happens is, it's very difficult to convince people that we are living in the world's largest democracy, where attacks on press freedom were unheard of. But over the last few years, the attacks on journalists have been consistent. And India is in the 162nd position of the World Press Freedom Index. We have journalists behind bars on terror charges for reporting their stories, often for stories they have not even reported. So some of us are being made examples for an entire population, especially for younger independent journalists. I mean, journalists with the backing of an organization often get support from their organization and others, but independent journalists, largely so, young independent journalists in India are having a tough time without any support, and that's where we all fit in. We are trying to speak an unpopular truth in a regime that has built journalists as the enemies of the state, whether it is Clarke, whether it is Daphne Caruana Galizia, whether it's in India, journalists in Kashmir. Everybody is fighting an unpopular battle. And this is the new reality for journalism, especially in democracies.
Thank you, Rana. And we'll come back if you're okay to hang on for the rest of the panel. Turning then to Sir John Whittingdale. Sir John, I wonder if you could discuss the work of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in establishing the National Committee for the Safety of Journalists and other mechanisms, and the response of the government to the issue of slaps.
Yes, of course. Well, I've been involved in the issues around media freedom for a long time. Before joining the government, I was chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee of Parliament for 10 years. And I've been chair of the all-party parliamentary group for media freedom. And this is my third incarnation, if you like, as a government minister with responsibility for media. And obviously, I've been very concerned about the appalling threats that journalists face overseas, which is why I worked with government in the establishment of the Global Coalition for Media Freedom, where we signed up 49 countries now. But I was conscious that whilst the journalists in the UK don't necessarily face the same level of physical threat, although it does happen, sadly, nevertheless, journalists do need additional protection in the UK as well. And that's why we established the National Committee for the Safety of Journalists, which I helped set up when I was in my second time as a government minister in 2020. The National Committee brings together representatives of journalists, of publishers, of newspaper editors, along with the police, the prosecuting authorities, and some of the campaigning groups like Reporters Without Borders. And we drew up the first national action plan to cover the safety of journalists. That included commissioning legal advice to journalists as to exactly what their rights were and what they should do if they were subject to threats. We established agreement across all of the police forces in the UK that they should have journalist safety liaison officers in each force. And we've been working with editors and indeed the platforms, because we commissioned a survey which made it plain that journalists were facing online harassment, and therefore we worked with the platforms to address that. And we're in the process of refreshing the national plan, and part of that is a recognition that actually slaps are another form of intimidation of journalists. And so the government has been examining what we can do to tackle slaps. We've already passed a measure within the Economic Crime Bill, which deals specifically with slaps around economic accusations, which allows the courts to dismiss these. But we want to look at other mechanisms that might be available. So we have a task force now specifically concentrating on slaps, which again brings together publishers, lawyers, journalists, and cyber campaigning groups. We will be publishing a work plan from the task force very shortly. And I do think there are a number of specific measures which we can take working alongside bodies like the Law Society to try and ensure that there is a much greater legal clarity about what is permissible and what is not. And we'll also be looking at whatever other measures can be taken.
Thank you so much, Sir John. We really appreciate you taking the time. And it's really, really important to see SLAPs integrated now into that framework of the safety of journalists and given that recognition. So that's a great development here. Peter, turning then to the situation in the Netherlands, you are running what is often held up to be the best journalist safety mechanism in the world.
In the world, even?
I think so. Everybody says
Whoa.
PersVeilig. So
I thought only in Europe, but now it's the world already.
Well, take it. But can you explain sort of what's the response in the Netherlands to the issue of slaps? How is it being dealt with there within this protection?
Yeah, well, slap, I mean, we always look to England like that's the country of slap. Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen in the rest of Europe. It's a problem for the other side of the canal, mm-hmm. and not for us. Unfortunately, that has changed, so that's why I'm here, because we see it's coming up.
Yeah.
And I mean, indeed, we have a platform in the Netherlands. We passed today the 200 incidents with journalists in this year, 23. But that's physical violence, that's online harassment, all that kind of stuff that is much more visible. Mm. Only 3 or 4 cases of legal threats. And but we know it is there. So we did a survey earlier this year because we got signals that more and more legal threats are coming towards journalists. So we did a survey and 800 journalists participated. 50% of them said, oh yeah, legal threats, yeah, oh, we have to deal with it. Mm. I mean, I've been a journalist myself for 25 years. I never had a legal threat. Really? Maybe I was not a good journalist, that's possible, no. But never ever. It just didn't happen, and now a lot of journalists say it happens. We were in a university with students, and there was a young woman, 19, 20 years old. She had an internship. She got a phone call from a lawyer, and the lawyer said, I hope you have enough money for your study. I hope your parents have a nice house because they live there and there, and that they have enough money for you, because if you continue making this story, 20 years old, a lawyer calling her. So we said that it is becoming a problem. So we have, I hear about the task force. We started as well with publishers, also with lawyers, to see what we can do, because we are way behind to what you have. If I heard the discussions also this morning, we are way behind it. We don't have too many slap cases. That's the only positive thing. It's legal threats, but that already leads to self-censorship among many journalists. Not so many real slap cases, but we feel it comes up. So we better take steps now than wait until everyone has to go to court. And especially for freelancers, they are vulnerable. Small media organizations like investigative journalism organizations are vulnerable. So we have funding now to support them when it comes to a case. We have lawyers who assist them to do the first analysis and after threats and to write emails for them. So we take a few steps now, but many more steps have to be taken.
And you also mentioned earlier that one of the ways that smaller investigative outlets protect themselves is to pair with larger groups.
Yeah, we have a few of these investigative journalism organizations. They do terrific work, and but they have to deal with all the threats, of course, because they do research on bigger companies, but also government, etc. Also international. So what they now do is that they call the public broadcaster or one of the big daily newspapers and say, listen, we are working on a story on Tim Watson. And because I heard fraud, that was it? Yeah. So this will be a big story. So can we cooperate? And then the bigger news organization said, yes, we will cooperate. And the small investigative journalism organization is doing this to protect themselves already, because they know the bigger media organization, they have lawyers, they have money, and so in that way they protect themselves even before they start the research on Tim. Yeah, sorry.
On Tim's fraud.
I didn't want to mention it, by the way.
So Tim, turning to you, can you talk a little about the work of the NUJ and the role that you're playing in the National Committee on the Safety of Journalists?
Sure. I mean, firstly, my apologies that I'm not Michelle. She would do a much better job than I can. So, but I will try and tell you some of the things that I know that she would have wanted to say. So we're, I mean, the National Union of Journalists is a trades union of about 25,000 members. We have approximately 200 collective agreements with publishers. So much of our work is representing our members industrially, trying to advance their interests industrially, but we also defend them legally. We've taken many, many legal cases on behalf of members who have either been, you know, people have tried to shut them up, people have tried to stop their work. Good to see Bill in the audience, who perhaps is one of our most famous cases some years ago when a publisher attempted to force him to reveal his sources. So taking that role, I mean, we were very enthusiastic about the establishment of the National Committee for the Safety of Journalists. Indeed, we pressed the government for it over some years, and we're delighted when they responded. And in some respects, I mean, it has been a body that has, I mean, one of the good things about it is it has concerned itself with genuinely practical work, genuinely practical objectives, sometimes quite modest ones, but the very fact of it being in existence and doing business, I think, is really, really important. In much the same way that the newly coined SLAPS legislation is, you know, is clearly very narrow in its scope, but the very act of having that on the statute book, I think, establishes that this is an important matter of legal concern. It puts in the mind of judges, I would hope, that the law can be used in this way, and part of their role is to guard against that. So, I mean, much of the work of the National Committee, as I say, has been, you know, what in a sense looks quite modest. It's surveyed to try and assess the level and extent of threats. It has issued guidance. It has ongoing surveys. It has produced training materials that are dispensed by the National Council for the Training of Journalists. It's produced, or rather the Society of Editors and the NUJ on its behalf, produced an online safety toolkit for journalists. It's provided training for the police. And in the very near future, I'm hoping it will establish an ongoing press freedom safety tracker. I mean, I have to say, and again, I'm speaking very much for Michelle here in saying that she very much wishes that the UK safety initiative was budgeted as PersVeilig is. I mean, much of what the National Committee is doing is on a real shoestring. But I think that process of actually tracking on a day-to-day basis, I mean, this is partly modelled on work done in the Netherlands, the threats and the jeopardies that journalists face is really important because it simply hasn't happened until now. And I mean, just to give you a small personal story to illustrate how absent any kind of reporting has been, quite a long, I mean, 20 years ago, I was working as a reporter in Edinburgh. I very foolishly went to meet an underworld contact in what turned out to be a disused pub in a very challenged area of Edinburgh, and I found myself with a gangster holding a knife to my throat for nearly 2 hours while his boss lectured me on how my stories should be developed in the coming weeks. And I mean, I was terrified. I was completely unprepared for it. It was very foolhardy for me to have gone in there to do it. But when I stopped shaking, you know, I went back into, you know, they released me. I went back into town. I phoned my editor, and we both had a laugh about it. We both, you know, it was like, I don't know, you've sort of earned your stripes. Any sense that it might be reported, even when a week later the police called me in because they had I'd been doing stories that had come to their attention. It didn't even cross my mind to say to them, I met these hoodlums and they held a knife to my throat for a long period of time. It just didn't occur to me. Now, you know, happily, I wasn't traumatized in a way that has sort of overshadowed my career, but it's very easy to understand how it might be. Particularly, I mean, and I think this goes into where I'd like to see the National Committee moving to look at. The level of online threat that journalists are facing, you know, now is extraordinary and overwhelming, just in terms of harassment and criticism, which clearly all the surveys we see of it show that it massively disproportionately affects women and journalists from ethnic minorities. Only last week, in my capacity as a member of the NEJ's Finance Committee, I met with a member of the union who works for a provincial newspaper in the UK, who has been subjected to over a year of crazy online hostility from somebody who was incidentally involved in a tribunal case that she reported. And to see her shaking and crying and sobbing as she told this story and explained the incredibly complicated legal strategy that she was now trying to pursue through the civil courts. This man had been convicted of criminal harassment, he'd had restraining orders placed on him, but she was now hoping to pursue a civil case against the online platforms that have refused to take down the harassing material. You know, to see a relatively young woman shaking and crying and saying, you know, talking about how it had devastated her life, just underlined to me how much we have to do. And fundamentally, I think at heart, it's about creating a culture where journalism is, the importance of journalism is recognised, and the fact that people do it for their work, they do it for their livelihoods, and they deserve straightforward respect and consideration and ability to do their work without having to face those kind of threats is kind of the situation that we need to be working towards.
Thank you, Tim. And I think the issue of changing the culture that came up a lot at the beginning of the SLAPS work, and a lot of journalists did think, look, this is part of the job, you know, that you receive these threats and you don't talk about them, and you definitely don't draw extra attention to them. And it was something that Daphne's family was very insistent on, that you know, people begin to talk about these threats and that they are not part of the job, that they are to be called out, and that there must be repercussions for those who take them, in the same way that there are repercussions for those who attack physically or online journalists. And that's why I suppose the punitive sanctions element of the legislation that we're trying to get through is so important, because there has to be a price for taking these cases. On that note, Jan, you are leading the high-level panel of legal experts, an expert on media freedom and a barrister here in the UK. So you have a very good insight into how the legal world is working. Can you comment on, you know, your work with different states? They have very different stances on the issue of SLAPS and legal abuse. So what's happening internationally, and what direction are we going in?
Let me wind back a little bit. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. I'm very loud.
No, you're good.
No, I'm good? Okay. So I remember, I mean, Sir John mentioned this Media Freedom Coalition, which is now 50 strong. It's a coalition of states, which has got 3 pillars. You've got the states at pillar 1, Then there's a panel of legal experts or independent legal experts who advise these states. Then there's the consultative network, which is led by civil society. It's a very interesting project. I'm part of the high-level panel, which is this independent legal advisory arm. It's chaired by Lord Neuberger, the former president of the UK Supreme Court. And listening to Rana, listening to all of you, in fact, I sort of went back to 2019, which is when this Media Freedom Coalition was established. And that's when we were established as a body of legal experts. And our first meeting, and not meant to talk about very much, the things that we discussed, but I, absolutely say that we knew that states wouldn't come up with the problems, that we had to come up with the problems and then start coming up with some of the legal remedies. And so we had a day-long discussion, I remember, chaired by Lord Neuberger, pre-COVID, and we decided that there were real gaps in the framework for protection for safety of journalists. It's not a very radical starting point, but just go back to 2019, and we identified 4 main areas. One was safe refuge, one was the problem of impunity, journalist deaths not being properly investigated, one was strengthening consular support, and the fourth was, of course, and this is in no particular order, sanctions. There's got to be a price to pay for those who will persecute or target journalists in a different way. However, during that discussion, we also identified something that we called systemic restrictions on the media. And we decided that there are these things that states are beginning to do, or wealthy, powerful individuals are doing, perhaps not enough for there to be patterns regionally. And of course, expensive lawsuits was one of them. Using the criminal law to shut up journalists, not by reference to the usual playbook of overbroad terrorist legislation, but actually, Rana mentioned money laundering. Jose Ruben Zamora is behind bars in Ecuador for money laundering. Maria Ressa, tax fines, criminal statutes, foreign ownership, criminal complaints. I mean, these are quite difficult to explain, but they are very powerful ways of shutting up independent journalists and muzzling investigative journalism. And I do want to say at this stage, I really want to commend the organisers of this conference, but also more broadly the coalition, because I recall, conversations had in Tallinn, which was 2021 or 2022. But what this group has achieved in terms of putting SLAPS on the map is phenomenal. Obviously, each state, and I'm going to move on to the international in a moment, but what has been achieved in a relatively short space of time, it really is a success story in the way in which this group has brought together experts, journalists, civil society, lawyers, etc. It's a fantastic model which I think can be deployed in other areas of media freedom. Now, when it comes to the international picture, of course, I mean, there's been a lot of activity in this country, and I know it's been the subject of discussion in 2 prior conferences. We're now got to the tracking implementation stage, and the task force that Sir John mentioned, the legislative amendment in June. The Council of Europe has got a draft recommendation, and everyone in this room will know about the EU directive. But I think in terms of my own perspective as sort of co-leading a body of legal experts who states come to for advice on draft legislation, I think the next step, especially outside of Europe, is going to be states looking for analysis on what the specific loopholes in their own legislation might be, how they're being exploited, and what the legal remedies to that might be. It may be in legislation. it may be found somewhere else. It was very interesting. We were asked by the Inter-American Court Human Rights to intervene in a criminal defamation action. We used that as an opportunity as a group of legal experts to try to slightly put, slaps onto the map of the court. And it's the first time in their judgment, it's the El Universo case, where the court noted the existence of slaps and how they work. And it's very, very important, I think, that, obviously we've got the UK here, we've got Europe is a huge concern for people in this room, but we need to think about truly, a global rule out of the raising awareness in this area. And so far as the high-level panel is concerned, we've always sort of prioritized this. Obviously, this has moved from a subtopic in our systemic restrictions piece in 2019 to what can we, as the high-level panel, do to support. And we've been very lucky to have Helena Kennedy on our panel. She's doing a lot above and beyond her place on the panel in this area, but also Dario Milo, some of you will have heard from last year, but also this year. And of course, the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute is the secretariat to the high-level panel and is obviously one of the energizing forces here. So all I would like to stress at this point is how important it is, beyond the United Kingdom and beyond the European framework, to really grapple with what the specific loopholes are in a jurisdiction and to put forward, custom solutions rather than a one-size fits all. Just one example, Sarah, and then we'll open it up. Early dismissal is something that we as a panel absolutely agree is very, very sensible. It may not work in certain jurisdictions because of the way it's an inquisitorial system rather than an adversarial system. That may not be the starting point, but there may be other as powerful tools.
Right.
And, costs. Final thing is, I think this is an area, and I think this group has been very good about this. This is an area where it's worth talking to commercial lawyers, costs lawyers, and to move beyond media lawyers or international human rights lawyers. And I'm seeing that already in some of the suggestions that are coming from the bar, etc. So I hope that just sort of sets the scene and provides my perspective on things.
Yeah, and I think we've already seen with the trilogue negotiations around the directive just how difficult it is to reconcile civil and common law practice here, and that early dismissal has been a huge problem for states that would usually be our allies, like the Netherlands, like Germany, because they see it as an overly like an over interference in their civil procedural rules. So we've already, we're aware of that, but it is such a crucial pillar of any anti-SLAPP regime. So that's why we're still pushing for it so strongly. I wonder if there are questions for our brilliant panelists from the audience. I see one already. Rana and Sir John, I just want to make sure you're still here.
Yes, very much.
I'm still here.
You're still here. Maybe, Sir John, I'm just picking up on Tim's point. He mentioned that maybe if Michelle were here, she might ask about the funding of both the committee, and maybe what we also see in the Netherlands is actually funding provided for the defence against SLAPPs. I wonder if that is in the gift of this government to increase maybe funding to national safety mechanisms. That's my question. If you want to think about that, I'm going to just collect from the audience. We have a lady here. I don't know if someone here with a mic. Poppy's coming.
Yes.
Just here.
Thank you so much. I think the initiatives are very, very promising, and they are with good intent. but I would say that the mediascapes since 2019 have changed drastically. So my question is, or a comment is that, you know, media freedom is a term which needs a bit of reinvestigation. Even if it is for, I mean, if you have 50 governments looking at this collaboration, where are we looking at? I mean, how do you explain Gen Z about media freedom when they're going to TikTok for their information sharing? I think we need to really look at the facts of how the media ecosystem has changed and transformed, and transforming by the minute, actually the second.
Thanks.
If we are actually looking into any kind of possible formulation policy moving forward, just a comment.
Thank you. Nick also has a question, and then I'll go back to the panelists.
Thank you. It's a question for Rana. Especially in the UK, you hear a little bit of rumbling, a little bit of reporting on, you know, like threats against NewsClick, threats against Mohammed Zabir, who was in and out of detention. But there's not as much focus on sort of like civil law threats against journalists, the use of defamation, which I know in India, which I know can spread out for 10, 15 years. I just want to know a bit more detail about how have been forced to navigate this space and how you see the legal threats specifically in India, because in the UK it's not well known enough, and I think it's such an important aspect of the threats to media freedom in India that I don't think we have a good grasp of.
Thanks, Nick. And maybe even if I could just add to that, this, you know, where we have huge issues around criminal law, detentions and physical threats in places like Turkey, for example, the issue of slaps can actually be just very under the radar because you're simply so overwhelmed with all of the research on other issues.
Yeah.
And it's something that we're now at CASE starting to look at non-EU Council of Europe countries, and the particular difficulties of where you have a captured judiciary. What do you do where the judiciary isn't independent? So these are some of the issues that are coming up, and what are we asking for in those contexts? Okay, so maybe we could start with Sir John, and then we'll go to Rana.
Yes, thank you. I mean, the committee is staffed by, obviously, officials both from my own department, the DCMS. We also draw upon officials from the Home Office. The co-chair of the committee is a Home Office minister, and then we have representation from the Ministry of Justice. So quite a lot of civil service and ministerial resources going into the committee. And where necessary, we have been able to provide some funding over things like the provision of the legal guidance and the press safety tracker. But I don't think that the answer is particularly in the realm of spending money. If there were a case for doing so, obviously we'll look at it. But actually, I think we're looking at what other measures can be taken. I was struck by something that Peter said about how the UK is known as the sort of slaps capital. I mean, and it's true. There are a lot of slaps that go through the UK courts, and that's not something that I'm proud of. I am, on the other hand, proud of the fact that one reason is perhaps because we have some of the most, you know, assiduous and rigorous investigative journalists in the world. So a lot of those suffering from slaps are indeed British. But I'd be interested to look particularly at what more we can do around perhaps are the law firms that are involved. There are firms that are notorious for taking on these cases, and that's also an aspect of this which we'll be talking to the Law Society about. So I think there are a whole range of measures, but I think a lot of them don't actually require funding.
Respond to that? Or?
Well, I think on the funding issue, I mean, it would be interesting to do a straight comparison with what's happening in the Netherlands to what's happening here. I think the results and the package that's being delivered in the Netherlands is substantial and impressive, and it would, you know, for all that I am delighted that this government has put such energy and effort into the National Committee, which I fully acknowledge. I think greater results would be delivered with more funding, and you know, in overall ministerial terms, we're talking about very small sums of money. I mean, really, there aren't actually that many journalists compared with most other occupations. I mean, just a small note on the sort of earlier point. Well, first, I'd just say, I'd meant to say earlier, I'm humbled to be on a panel with Rana, whose investigation of policing in Gujarat is outstanding, and if anybody hasn't read it, I would recommend it very highly. It's clear in many countries the way that media has evolved, you know, the nature of the threats, whether, you know, in countries like Turkey and in India, where huge swathes of the media has been captured by political actors, fundamentally the ruling parties. So through its ownership, you know, they have been able to, you know, very substantially neuter much of the press. So I think one has to have, you know, when you're thinking about media freedom, the whole economic media sphere, that was the term somebody used earlier, I think is really important. Places which don't have newspapers don't have reporting. Places which have, you know, newspapers that once had 200 journalists that now have 50, you know, there's a lot less news. And considering how you create circumstances where there are more people reporting, where there are more people doing that most basic job of just going to events, watching things happen, talking to people, and whether they're writing that down or whether they're, you know, delivering that through the broadcast medium or even perhaps through the TikTok medium, the more people doing that, the more perspectives we have, the better we understand society, and the better, I think, the whole liberty and democracy of society is enhanced.
John?
No, just going to follow up. I mean, I think that, you know, 50 states coming together on media freedom, I think the message has been received very loudly and clearly that the media landscape has changed. And that's in thanks to people like Carol Cadwallader, Maria Ressa, Nobel Prize laureates, etc. I don't think that is the message for states anymore. But the question is, how can you deal with increased distrust in traditional media at the same time that disinformation is completely, you know, off the scale? And how can you keep journalists safe? And how the economic model, I could not agree with you more. Of course, there's a journey to media capture. And a lot of these systemic, you know, the tax investigations, etc., that is actually how governments speed up the change of media ownership. And there are so many different challenges. What I would say in terms of the message to states, and Sir John is here, you know, one can be very proud of what one has done so far as slaps are concerned. But the key thing, I think, for states that can point to good practice in their own jurisdiction, or even if it's not good practice, you know, going the right direction, etc., is to ensure that this is not only a conversation about a subset issue like slaps. The broader context is absolutely critical. If you're talking to an ally about slaps, you also need to talk to an ally about the other systemic restrictions that we've talked about. And that conversation between states, I think that's where there's a little bit of work that needs to be done at the state level.
Thank you, John. So Rana, we're going to just come over to you, and actually just very briefly before we come over to you, I just wanted to note with Sir John that maybe one area of that we've really highlighted at the Coalition is that SLAP targets should be eligible for legal aid. That's something maybe that financially it would be very important for the government to expand that eligibility requirement to SLAP targets, and I think that would go a long way. We've heard all day about the costs involved in defending oneself, so I think that would be really a huge commitment from the government to SLAP targets. Rana, just coming back on Nick's point, he had asked if you could talk a little bit more about the abuse of civil law in India.
Absolutely. But before I answer the question, there is a very pertinent point I think that John raised about the money laundering and financial charges that are now being slapped at journalists, whether it is Jose Zamora or Maria, or for that matter. So as we discover innovative ways of journalism, the governments in different parts of the world has figured innovative ways of discrediting journalists. And earlier they would think that let's slap sedition, war against nation, defamation, but now they have brought in financial terrorism charges in an attempt to kind of muddy the waters, right? That's what happens in cases like this. Is you throw in salacious
Yeah.
gossip about a journalist's finances and income, right? And you throw that in the public domain. And when there is so much of misinformation that plagues social media, a lot of it gets in the way of journalists. Before you go to the court for justice, there is a media trial that happens based on this salacious gossip and the picket and the leaks and the selective leaks done by the government, especially in financial terror charges. So I think that's something we really need to speak about, because that's a really innovative way that governments have decided to kind of target journalists. To answer Nick's question, of course, defamation is this very wide spectrum where anybody can get defamed in the times that we are living in, right? In a country like India, especially journalists from the minority community, we talked about Zubair, who was behind bars for a very, very innocuous tweet, but somebody with just 2 Twitter followers took offense to that, and because of which he went behind bars. In my case, the allegation against me is, because I'm a practicing Muslim, I did an investigation against the majority community. So defamation has become this broad stroke where anybody can get defamed, and you get tied in this battle which goes on for years at a stretch, from the lower courts to the higher courts and the Supreme Courts. So while you're doing your journalism and your reporting, you spent a big part of your time in fighting these cases, right? I mean, I had some work, but I had to leave everything because I have a hearing tomorrow. I have to appear in court tomorrow, and this is going to drag on for years. That's the point of these cases. That's the point of defamation or draconian charges like Prevention of Money Laundering Act, is to keep the journalist uh, in caught in this web of legal cases where you spend your time and effort and a big chunk of your salary paying lawyers in defending charges, and by the time you're acquitted of these charges, you're already exhausted as a person and as a journalist, which brings down your morale, right? Some of us are journalists with social capital, with organizations that back us. But look at something like NewsClick, an independent news organization that was raided by the Indian government 2 months ago, based on what they said was a New York Times investigation. But there were 19, 20-year-old journalists who were raided, whose houses were raided, whose equipments were taken. My biggest fear is, will these journalists think of continuing their reportage based on what they have just experienced? I mean, these are young minds. Imagine to intimidate them. That's what these charges do. You create an atmosphere of fear. These young journalists whose houses were raided in the NewsClick investigation, I fear they're traumatized. We are leaving behind a generation of young journalists who will think twice before joining journalism. And that is something we also need to think and address.
Thank you, Rana. The chilling effect of this is so huge. And I can see it even, amongst NGOs where we've come close to or have seen legal threats in our vicinity, and I can see it in myself. It makes you much more anxious, and it's very worrying. It's really worrying. So you can experience it, at so many levels, even when you're so protected. I wonder if there are any other questions from the audience. I wonder if, on that note, maybe just to ask what you would like to see of the panelists. So I know we're living in some very difficult times. I always think the SLAPS work is one of the areas that gives me the most hope, because it's quite measurable. We started this 5 years ago and have come some way, not the whole way, but it's actually very easy to track. And I really echo Jan's appreciation for all the people in the room, because it really is quite easy to see the cause and effect of this advocacy. And Tim, you said earlier to me in discussion, you said, it was like all of the work that then hit an opportunity, which was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where the mood here shifted dramatically. But all of that work was ready to push through. So that's really, really important. And similarly with the SLAPS work in Europe, it was very much the family of Daphne who secured the commitment for the directive. So we see that in the next few months, we're at a real peak moment of legislation. The EU directive, Council of Europe recommendation, soft law, but important. And obviously here in the UK, we have the Economic Crimes Bill and a real push for a standalone anti-SLAP law. What else would you like to see? Is there areas that maybe we're not addressing yet, or that you would like to see kind of coming down the line, Jan?
I'm sure I'll have eggs thrown at me for saying this.
Go on.
I mean, obviously, in countries where there is broad rule of law compliance and/or there is at least an international legal framework as a matter of last resort, whether it's the Council of Europe, whether it's the European Union, etc. Legislation is a very, very powerful way to proceed, because you're counting on independent lawyers, you're counting on independent judiciary. There's very soon, once those steps have been taken, and they're not at all easy to take, and we're in the process of that sort of round one, there is going to be a round two of how do you deal with this kind of action where there are rule of law issues in the state, or governments change very quickly and then make it quite clear that non-state actors that go after journalists will not be punished, etc. That is where it's going to get. I think some of the sort of legislative reform isn't going to cut it. Yeah. And then we need to think, and I'm sure this room is already thinking, but you raised Turkey, there are a whole host of other countries where you just need to think about that is being used not as the primary way of shutting up journalists, but that's the way of bankrupting the journalist, Absolutely. The investigative reporter, etc. And this tactic of making the journalist the news story and then trying to attach personal liability for their investigative work is obviously extremely effective. For every Rana, for every Carol, for every Maria, there will be 50 or 100 or 1,000 younger journalists who decide they're not going to do this because they can't do it for their family, etc. So those protections have to be pretty broadly drawn. So that's, I think, it's the sort of round two. Not that we've got round one sort of sewn up and sorted, but I think it's also to think about that.
Thank you. Sir John and Rana, would you have what would you like to see as next steps? Sir John?
Well, I mean, I think it's a sad truth that, firstly, the need for professional journalism has never been greater, particularly with the level of disinformation that we're now encountering. And at the same time, this is perhaps the most dangerous year to be a journalist that we can remember for a long time. So, I mean, I think the issues we're discussing are immensely important. And tackling SLAPS is a part of that, but it's just one component of what the committee is looking at. And I'm very open to legislative measures if they are going to be effective. But we are keen to work alongside reporters, publishers, campaigning groups, all of those, to identify a whole sort of suite of measures to deal with this.
Thank you, Sir John. Rana, over to you.
I just feel like journalists should be made to feel less lonely in what can be a very lonely ordeal for them. I think they need to be told that people who are well-meaning have got their back. A lot of journalists out there are feeling very, very lonely in that attempt, and they're also trying to self-censor themselves to avoid getting into more problems. And this process, it's taking we have not even spoken about the emotional toll this takes. I mean, the psychological toll this takes on many journalists when they're fighting these legal battles. I think the attempts should be made to show more solidarity with journalists who do not really have that kind of support, organizational support, to make them feel that their work is important and it will be protected by those who mean well.
Thank you, Rana. Tim, Peter, any final thoughts?
Yeah, for me, two things. The first place, someone said, I think it was you, it's not part of the job.
No.
And I think, again, because we are way behind you, there's maybe sometimes a feeling that it is still a part of the job. And it's not. And we really, I mean, when it comes to physical violence, online harassment, we all drew that red line already. And for us, and I think in other European countries as well, like in Germany, and I talked in Germany about it, there's also the feeling like, yeah, it's coming up, but it's maybe not that bad. But we have to draw a line ourselves as well. It's not part of the job. And that also gives a responsibility to media and journalists themselves, not to hide when it comes to legal threats, but to report it and to come forward. What I said, we had 200 incidents this year, only 3 or 4 when it comes to legal threats. And it's much more, but they just don't come forward, journalists. So they have to report, so we can support them, stand around them. The second thing is, and that's the discussion that we now have with lawyers, bar association and so on. I mean, in the Netherlands, a few years ago, a lawyer was killed. Lawyers are under threat, officially announced by the National Coordinator Terrorism and Security. Lawyers are under threat. Same for judges, prosecutors' office, and journalists. 4 groups in society in the Netherlands are under threat. So I talk a lot with the Bar Association. So I said, listen, you are under threat, we are under threat, and you are threatening us. That's not okay. So, so they are now working also on a kind of a code, because most threats to journalists, when it comes to slap and legal threat, is done by lawyers from companies and independent lawyers. So we're really in discussion with them to stop it. But I think the first step for us now is the media organization themselves. They have to take steps, report it, show to the world it's not part of the job, and then we go from there.
Thank you, Peter. Tim?
Well, as Peter's been cheeky and had 2, I'll do the same. Firstly, I mean, in my day job, I work for the International Federation of Journalists. We're currently promoting a UN convention on the safety of journalists, which would codify much of the existing safeguards that there are. I mean, this is something on which we've been working for several years now. But I think the importance of achieving that, in the same way as, you know, the SLAPS legislation that maybe doesn't go quite as far as we want, creating a significant signifier at supranational level that the safety of journalists is important and something about which we can do something, I think would be enormously valuable. And I'd like as much support for that really as we can muster. And secondly, I think we have to start considering how in education we talk more profoundly about information integrity and about the differences in, you know, when I talk to my teenage children and they don't really differentiate on things that they've learned from TikTok and from things that they've learned from the BBC. Yeah. In fact, because they're critical of some of the BBC's news values, they actually value TikTok rather higher, which is crazy. I mean, it simply doesn't make sense. But it's kind of endemic, I think, in education. I remember my son coming home and saying, they've told us that we can copy stuff out of Wikipedia for our essays. And me spending some time explaining why that was a terrible idea, and then storming up to the school to see the head teacher, who was utterly uninterested in my arguments that you failed to develop understanding, that you're abusing other people's copyright, that you're you know, the many reasons. But so I think we need to think about how we systematically build a deeper understanding of qualities of information into education.
Thanks, Tim. So to Sir John and to Rana, thank you so much for joining us. Rana, best of luck in court tomorrow. And we know it's very late where you are, so we really, really appreciate it. To Jan, Peter and Tim, thank you for being great panellists. To our audience, thank you for staying late. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. What time is it starting, Susan? 9:15? Wonderful. And with that, have a great evening. Thank you.